I'm Dawn Lundy Martin. I'm co-director of the Center for African American Poetry and Poetics here at the University of Pittsburgh, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to tonight's event. Writers Renee Gladman and John Keene will read new work, and Latasha N. Diggs, who is in residence in Pittsburgh for the week as a part of our Dream Space residency, will present a new, I don't know what it is, I'm gonna call it a sonic scene. A sonic scene that emerges, a sonic what? Oh, a sonic lecture that emerges from her reading of Gladman's and Keene's works. She is joined by her sometimes musical collaborator, Val Jeanty. We're gonna shake things up a little bit tonight I hope in more ways than one, but one way we're gonna do that is that even though Latasha is making a sound lecture in response to work by Gladman and Keene, Latasha and Val will actually present their work first, followed by John, and Renee will be our final reader. We want to invite you to think through the relationship between language and music, between sound and utterance, between gesture and thought. In my original invitation to this group of esteemed artists, I asked that they consider, however obliquely, our curatorial organizing principle for the year, Black Futures. And I was thinking about the tether between the past and the present, and thinking or trying to think of liberatory spaces that the work of artists might help to manifest. And this seemed, for me, in my thinking, to be a necessity of the moment. I was thinking of work by writers that seems to break the rules, act derelict, and forget the regimes of convention necessary to operate solidly within a certain genre, and how revolutionary that might be. And I was thinking of Black writers who negotiated what it means to be a contemporary self or being. And the future in this latter case is concurrently occurring within the present. That John Keene and Renee Gladman came to mind is no accident. Both of them work within multiple disciplines and genres. John Keene is a writer of prose and poetry, a translator and an artist. Renee Gladman is a writer of prose and poetry and an artist, and both are creative intellectuals I hold in extremely high regard, forever reaching toward and attempting to model my own engagement with art and the world on their persistent, borderless immersions in making. Likewise, Latasha N. Diggs operates somewhere in between poetry, translation, sound, and music, destabilizing in some way what we think of when we think of language. Is silence a language? What is a wordless sound? Is that a language? Latasha has brought her musical collaborator, Val Jeanty, an innovator in her own right, and I'm thrilled to be introduced to her work tonight and awe-filled about the coming together of these four artists here tonight in Pittsburgh. Thank you for joining us, all four artists. And special thanks to the Dietrich School and the Pittsburgh Foundation for their support of the work that we do at CAP. Some information before I get to the intros. Tonight's full program will be about an hour and a half long. It won't go over an hour and a half long. So we ask that you turn off your cell phones so that we can have your full attention, that we can all experience the evening fully. We also ask that you not leave in the middle of performances. Tonight's about the full experience, not just a bit chunk of it. Now I'm pleased to introduce Latasha N. Diggs and Val Jeanty. After their performance, I'm going to return to the stage to briefly introduce John and Renee. And after that, we'll all come to the stage for some moments of conversation and questions. Okay. A writer, vocalist, and sound artist, Latasha N. Diggs is the author of Twerk, Belladonna 2013. Her interdisciplinary work has been featured at the Brooklyn Museum, the Poesy Festival Berlin, the Museum of Modern Art, the QOW Conference in Slovakia, the International Poetry Festival in Bucharest, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Walker Art Center, and the 2015 Venice Biennale. As a curator and director, she's staged events around the world, and here are some of the places: BAM Cafe, Lincoln Center Outdoors, the David Rubenstein Atrium, Poets House, the High Line. Latasha is a recipient of numerous awards. Some of them include the New York Foundation for the Arts, the Barbara Deming Memorial Grant, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Jerome Foundation, the Japanese-U.S. Friendship Commission Creative Capital. She's also a winner of the 2016 Whiting Award for Poetry, and she is the co-founder and co-editor of my favorite title for a magazine, in fact, Coon Business / SO4 magazine. She lives in Harlem. Haitian electronic music composer, percussionist, turntablist Val Jeanty evokes the musical esoteric realms of the creative subconscious, self-defined as Afro-electronica. She incorporates her African Haitian musical traditions into the present and beyond, combining acoustics with electronics and the archaic with the postmodern. She works with a diverse array of artists, including Steve Coleman as a turntablist composer and Anthony Braxton as a recording engineer. She is the recipient of the Van Leer Grant, a Meet the Composer grant, and her project On was supported in part by the New York State Music Fund. Her Afro-electronica installations have been showcased all over the world, including the Whitney Museum, the Museum of Modern Art, the Village Vanguard, the Stanzer Music Taj in Switzerland, and the Biennale di Venezia Museum in Italy. So please welcome to Val Jeanty and Latasha Diggs.
Hello. Hi. So thank you so much, Don Lundy Martin and the Center for African American Poetry and Poetics at the University of Pittsburgh, because I just want to say it all. And thank you so much to the tech for your patience with us, and thank y'all for being here. So we're going to start our little lecture any minute now, so we'll just wait for video to start. Jan, we are begins. Jan, we are beckoning, seen, never dimming, God, wall light. Smooth, didn't we all this have the happiest desires? Sigh. Maroons don't know the rules and time. We confront the laws. Churning itself, we deliver to Maria. We we encounter desire. Don't you worry, Ayur. We stay happy, Tafuk. It's our destiny, Digla. We are Capescula. We are Capescula. We are Capescula. Corner store halal, these chicken wings on coke. Brother on his bologna and Swiss hustle and taped up Pringle cans for donations. Repel on fists with dingy K2 sequence. Shake on manic, my lovely young self-medicated thing. Into the bush you strip on way low, but stronger. Can you be stronger? Can you hold on strong to break this trip? May I buy you a piece of fruit on tab, true? Lascivious bastards, take vantage point. You're on a ratchet liberation. What of your soul community boards have sold? Police keep a distance, then dance on the watch like they care. Keeping on no quota, score, 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 Key. Key. I take 2 bricks from the church to balance my AC. I take an ear and a testicle to even the landing for my air supply. Hearsay has complicated things to tell. News from the homeless newspaper lost within ruins of candy shops. Op-eds from sharp gray-haired ladies who man voting machines. To the winos and to the knuckleheads. To leaning women high on their woes, whose hands can't hold on to dingy dollars. To those who guard liquor stores, make dollar stores altars with 1,000,000 candles in Xerox hand script. To the leaning open stores, pray they deserve a nickel worth of compassion from the Bangladeshi fruit stand vendor escaping his flooded flatlands. And to the gentrifier embarrassed by his coffee and his inactions. To the black boy named Zion who yells upwards towards broken ginkgo flesh. How do you expect me to settle when I was meant to rise? How do you expect me to sober when I was weaned on honey wine? How do you expect me to settle when I was meant to rise? How do you expect me to sober when I was weaned on honey wine? Where is my mother? Where is my father who stole my freedom on my birthday? Hey. Oh, Mary, sweet Mary, feeble child. Oh, Mary, second Mary, ain't for your master's kind. She never love or love or swoon the daddies like I do. She never get the chance to sail or watch humpbacks blow like I will. How do you expect me to settle when I was meant to rise? How do you expect me to sober when I was weaned on honey wine? Where is my mother, my fallen father, who stole my birthday on my birthday? Oh, Mary, sweet Mary, feeble child. Oh, Mary, sweet Mary, run from your master's kind. She never love or move or swoon the daddies like I do. She never get the chance to sail or watch humpbacks blow like I will. Eu sou queria noite, maldade, safado, puta que pariu, digla. Jeirama les lemenches. Não tempo perigo sal santo. 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 Hum, harum, hey. 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 I'm filled with angels. Hey. I've been paralyzed. I've been shot. I've seen purgatory. Man, I got angels. I'm filled with angels. I've got angels inside me. Nothing you can do to me. Nothing you can do to me. I'm filled with angels. Hey. I'm filled with angels. I'm filled with angels. Nothing you can do to me. Nothing you can do to me, man. I've been shot. I've seen purgatory. I've been shot. I've been paralyzed. I've been shot. I've seen purgatory, man. I got angels inside me. I got angels inside me. I got angels. I got angels. I got angels. I got angels. Huddle. Hey. Huddle. Hey. Huddle. Hey. For nigger pennies, they let my body be torn. Nigger pennies, 13 stories and large grand glass views. Glass that ignites the ginkgo shade for Frederick's wild fro, hosing rain on this dust from recouped synagogues, jitterbug ghosts, caught in the stained, shattered motifs, where the rites read, where the rituals done. Copper steel bricks aluminum make course for Beijing. Pastor wants the ruin course. Pastor wants the ruin course. Pastor wants the ruin cross. Treasurer meant to say an ear and a pickle jar, a penis and a pickle jar. Nigger pennies for new vans, quickly depreciating in this pyramid scheme. They do others favors like pay the rent, a congregation in limbo for a blessing. Don't you be mad, God is good. The thyroid bursts from dust that escapes the waters meant to lull. Is it harmful to breathe in a demolished church? Is it harmful to breathe in a near lamented body? To take showers in the dust of demolished asylums? Shall I be filled on dust like a 90-day-old shearwater chick on plastic waste? We once thought of architecture like groupers, like mullets, like snapper from the same hood. until the coral reef dies. For Jerry Allen. Let us meet at the Grand River. Take this maiden voyage, just us two, where we dance for the infidels. Your pure self, an itching in my heart. Angel, angel, let us meet at the Grand River. Let us meet at the Grand River. Let us meet at the Grand River, where we dance for the infidels. Angel, angel, let us meet at the Grand River. Let us meet at the angel, angel.
Wow, one more round of applause, please. Amazing. I have to say, I'm always surprised when I'm moved on campus. But thank you so much, and thank you for that beautiful piece for our colleague who recently passed, Jerry Allen. John Keene will read next, and then Renee Gladman, and then all of us will get on the stage and we'll have a discussion. So I'll just read your bios. John Keene's most recent book includes the short fiction collection Counter Narratives, New Directions 2015, which received a 2016 American Book Award, a 2016 Lannan Literary Award for Fiction, and a March 2017 the UK's inaugural Republic of Consciousness Prize. The art book Grind It, an art text collaboration with photographer Nicholas Mullner, and the poetry chapbook Playland, which came out in 2016. He's the author of all of those. He's also a translator of the Brazilian author Hilda Hilst novels, the novel Letter from a Seducer, Nightboat Books, 2014, and other works of fiction and poetry. He chairs the Department of African American and African Studies and also teaches English and creative writing at Rutgers University in Newark. Renee Gladman is a writer and artist preoccupied with lines, crossings, thresholds, and geographies as they play out in the interstices of poetry and prose. She is the author of 11 published works, including a cycle of novels about the city-state Ravika and its inhabitants, the Ravikians. Those books are Event Factory, 2010, The Ravikians, 2011, Anna Petova Crosses a Bridge, 2013, The Houses of Ravika, which is forthcoming this fall. And she's author of the recently released Prose Architectures, her first monograph of drawings, which is gorgeous. I encourage you to take a look if you haven't seen it already. And Calamities, a collection of linked essay fictions on the intersections of writing, drawing, and community, which was winner of the 2017 CLMP Firecracker Award for Creative Nonfiction. Her recent essays and visual work have appeared in the Paris Review, Granta, Harper's, Stonecutter, Poetry Magazine, and actually the N+1 that just came in the mail a couple days ago to me. And she was a 2014-15 fellow at Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University, a recipient of the 2016 Foundation for Contemporary Arts Grant, and a 2017 Lannan Foundation Writing Residency in Marfa, Texas. She makes work in New England. Please first welcome John Keene.
Okay, so before I begin, I just want to thank everyone for coming out tonight, and I want to thank Dawn, Lauren, Elizabeth, Imani, all of their students. I want to thank CAP, the University of Pittsburgh, and I also want to say it's an incredible honor to be presenting my work with Renee, Latasha, and Val. And let's give Latasha and Val another round. Now, of course, it's very hard to follow someone or people who have done given an amazing musical presentation. So I'm going to try to sort of shift us into prose, but musical prose. I'm going to read two short sections from a fairly short work on its own called Blues. The only things that you need to know are that the key figures in this are the poet Langston Hughes. This is Black Futures, but of course we can't really sort of understand our future unless we understand our past. So the two key figures here are Langston Hughes, who needs no introduction, and the great Mexican modernist Javier Biurrutia, who was a translator of Hughes and met him. And this entails the space of queer desire and connection. And I'm going to read two sections. Blues. He wanted to say something, but the English words at first eluded him when they met earlier that year at a secret party after the dinner given by Rafael Lozano at the German director Augustin's. The noted poet had been staying briefly in Mexico. Even before then, a few of them had shared his poems like talismans, reading them as if their lives depended upon it. He had translated 3 and published them in a local journal. The older poets had already dismissed this so-called literature condemned it, much like their peers in Harlem. All this pansy dust from the gutter passing for good writing, this only spurred them to read more and talk about it more, write more. Unforgettable as his verse, each thought to himself when the American entered the room, a compact beauty, tea-brown, highbrow, capped by wavy black hair. After receiving his drink, he stood at the center of their circle, smile flashing. Each was vying to get his attention. To their surprise, he spoke decent, vigorous Spanish in his soft, melodic voice, all strained to hear him. Maybe he was a Veracruzano who had grown up among gringos, a Mexican as the new star of American Negro literature. Someone whispered this in laughter. He mentioned his friend Jose Fernandez de Castro, the Cuban writer. Carlos corrected that he was from Missouri, wherever that was. His father, he told them, had managed an electric plant, run a ranch in Toluca. He had spent part of his adolescent years here. He had come to wrap up the estate. He was staying with family friends on the Calle de Ildefonso. Though grieving, he still appeared gay, something nevertheless held in reserve by that insistent grin. So as not to keep him standing, Agustin invited him to sit. The American recited lines by Lopez Velarde and Jimenez as he walked to the couch. They scrambled to places beside him. Agustin, as usual, slung his leg up over the easy chair's arm to show off his ample package. Roberto, who already had a boyfriend, nevertheless daintily perched on the edge of his seat. Antonietta, the lone woman among them, took it all in stride. He winked at her several times as he spoke, and she leaned forward too. His English name was not so easy to pronounce. Longstone is how they all kept saying it. He had no problem with any of theirs, forgetting not a single one, complimenting the German on the furniture, his modern taste. He, Javier, sipped his punch and observed those lips polishing each syllable, the nasturtium, rose incarnate of that mouth. He hated comparing things to flowers, but in that moment there was no other metaphor. The houseboy brought in canapes and nuts, and the American's eyes trailed his low, broad shoulders. Aha, some of them thought, campesinos are what he goes for. The German could unrefine his touch as needed. He unbuttoned his shirt collar, his fingers combing his chest. The poet offered his observations of the city's literary scene. Who, he asked, were the politically radical, the experimental writers? He spoke of the visual arts, his love of bullfighting, and los novilleros. He beamed a smile which made them all smile more. That's what he likes, the fighting daredevils. They were going to take him to a party at a painter's house. He agreed, and after several more rounds of drinks, they headed out, the German's hand on the American's waist, Elias's clasping his left elbow. He, Javier, followed a few steps behind, chatting with Antonietta, studying the visitor's solid back, ample buttocks. They piled into 2 cars, sped through the night to the painter's house. After 5 knocks, the man with the scar from his right eye to his chin ushered them in. Friends were already there. Everyone wanted to meet the American. A cross-dresser emerged from a stairwell, her conversation in mid-sentence. He, Javier, had another drink and then another. A man named Rodolfo he had never met before began whispering something in his ear. The American disappeared into the darkness. Then suddenly Longstone is at Javier's side, smiling, saying, I will be staying in the city for a little while longer. Javier mentioning his fellowship to study drama at Yale. If you get to New York, send word. We'll meet up in Harlem. He gives several contacts in order to reach him. Before Javier can answer, a bullfighter's expert hands spear the visitor's arm from behind, his eyes saying, this one is mine tonight, the 2 of them gliding away into the writhing hive. Javier, this is in New York, Javier asks questions about Harlem, when he'll be returning to Mexico. Langston promises a tour of Harlem and the rest of the city when Javier comes back. The drinks, then the main dishes arrive. The meal is passable, but there's the ambiance. All the restaurants, like the people up here, are suffering badly. Javier nods, affirming things are tough in Mexico City too. We're still waiting, Langston adds, on President Roosevelt to help us, and I mean us. We'll even take President Cardenas if he isn't too busy. Both laugh and launch into a discussion of poetry. The poets of Mexico first. Langston lists all he knows: Cuesta, Gorostiza, Torres Bodet, Ortiz de Montellano. Then other poets leaving their mark in the Spanish language: Darío, Vallejo, Guillén, the Chilean Mistral, and Neruda, especially the ones committed to the cause of political, economic, and social liberation. The contemporaneos are not communists, Javier responds, but are quietly striving to transform Mexican literature. What does he think of Borges? Langston asks. The avant-garde without a political compass can easily become reactionary. Javier assures him there is no danger of this among his group. You must read Alfonso Reyes, Gutierrez Cruz. What of the poets of Harlem, of America? He has heard of some of the names, but not many others. Cullen, yes, a master stylist. Douglas Johnson, the powerful McKay. Nugent, never heard of him. Bontemps, no. Grimke, Walrond Brown, no. He withdraws a little notebook and his fountain pen. He has to ask Langston to repeat a number of them. Then the white ones. Crane, why, of course, Crane came to Mexico a few years ago. Eliot, certainly, so erudite and forbidding. Pound, Williams, he is familiar with these, yes, and Bennett, Sandberg, Robinson, Millay. Stevens, no. Moore, no. H.D., no. Most are politically retrograde. The whole passel, including Hillier Coffin, as well as the Southern agrarians, though Ransom is a good poet and the rest not worth mentioning. There are poets with far better politics, like Fearing, Rukeyser, Davidman, Beecher. Does he know of any American poets who are of Mexican descent or write in Spanish? He will send Javier some issues of the newer periodicals he has appeared in. They talk of Gide, Wilde, Proust. Through their ideas of poetry, what makes it so necessary always, especially now, even more than novels or essays, like plays it is, Langston says, an immediate and economical way of reaching the masses, promoting the ideas that will foster and allow revolution to flourish in society. Look at the bloody lesson of Mexico, Javier says. One should exercise caution when invoking that term. He views poetry's role and power as more modest. Poetic language always carries the seed of something revolutionary, merely by being a testimony to one's always complex and difficult interior journeys. In language, you need to lose yourself to recover yourself. Yes, Langston says, that too, so true. Still talking, they finish dinner, another round of drinks. Javier mentions an early train back to New Haven. Over Langston's gentle objections, he pays the bill. The male couple, now openly holding hands at their table, offer familial approval. We are not afraid of the night. The next one will be my treat. They walk down to 125th Street to hail a taxi, shoulder to shoulder, fingers grazing. Javier offers to have the cab drop him off, then abruptly says, why don't you come back downtown with me, have a final nightcap, and relax? Langston muses a second, then agrees. There are places in Times Square where we can get a drink. I have a bottle of whiskey in my room. The taxi knifes through the city's dark canyons, the sky glowing blue as a gas flame. Javier presses his thigh into Langston's. They are discussing the options in nightlife. If this were a Saturday, I would have many places to take you. No bullfighters, but we have some things almost as delectable. Javier laughs and says, not everyone longs for a brute. Yes, Langston answers, a poet's touch can do the trick. The taxi lets him off right in front of the hotel. In the room, Javier takes Langston's hat, coat, and scarf. He glimpses himself in the mirror, more cold, more fire. Pours each a little glassful. They sip in silence for a while. Langston inspects the room, the neatly folded clothes, small pile of books, the sheaf of poems. Javier asks Langston if he is keeping him from anyone. No luck in that regard, he responds. They pour through my fingers like water. Ferdinand, AC, so beautiful, so beautiful, Javier says to himself. It seems incomprehensible. And you, I imagine you have someone back in Mexico City or someone new up in New Haven. There is a novio at home, but things are complicated. Always, Langston says, the toll you pay for your art. He sits down at the desk. Please don't read those poems. They aren't ready. But this one is a gem. Somnambulant, sleep and awakened all at once. In silence, I can roam the submerged city. That one is called Nocturnal Estancias. nocturnal ranches and stanzas. How intriguing. I think my whole next book will be a volume of nocturnes. I myself have written so many poems about the night. That is where I truly live. Javier pours each another drink, takes off his tie and coat. ¿Está cansado? Sí, un poco. It is getting late, Langston says. You have an early train and I a long trip back uptown. Please, no hurry. Finish your drink. Langston knocks it back. Thank you for a wonderful evening. Thank you. And I will be your Virgil through the city next time. Javier passes him his hat and coat. They embrace, peck each other's cheeks. He departs. Javier slips out of his remaining clothes, packs, sets the alarm clock. He notices Langston's scarf is still on the chair. He will mail it to the Emersons. When he reaches New Haven, he finishes off his cigarette, reads one of his poems. Not so bad, but not as yet as good as he wants it to be. Climbs into bed, douses the light. There is a knock on the door. He listens, ignores it. It persists. He rises, cracks it open. I'm so sorry, Javier, but I left my scarf here, I think. Please come in. It's just over there. Langston enters. He does not light the lamp. He wants to say something. Nothing to be said. Let hunger and instinct guide them in this confusion of bodies. He will show this one is mine. Slides Langston's coat from his shoulders, the jacket, tie, underpants, shoes, his lips. On his lips, their bodies bare together, his chest on his armpits and thighs. He guides his hand down there. He kneels and tastes his hard sacks of salt silkiness. He guides him to the bed. They caress and kiss. This mouth is mine. He climbs atop him, dulce, tan dulce. Tastes his salt again, takes his sex again in that blue darkness, spit and sweat, satin funk and musk sweetens his tongue opening. He takes him in dulce, slowly, again, a double death. Ay, morenito. This mouth is his, sweetly. Mi ángel fills him, the firm grip on his hips, nipples, ankles, fast now. Angel moving together in sync, this rhythm of men alone together. A blues fills them, he feels him deep inside his soul. Ay, negrito moans, this man is mi amor, short breaths as one together. Sweet fire, ay, cariño, they come to this, yes, this fire together. Cry, si, este fuego, si, si, softly, softly. They lie beside each other in the crepuscular dark, holding tight. Night pouring in to stir the blue-black shadows. Somewhere out there, dawn on the horizon. Somewhere out there, life. Somewhere, and trains to New Haven, the open grave of life, this dying room, its waning song. Will you write a poem about tonight? I already have, and you, I have too. Who would you give it to? You, my angel, and you, my very own, our secret. I loved my friend amid this solitude. Let us roam the night together, loving, living these blues. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Please welcome Renee Gladman.
Good evening. My God, amazing work from everybody. Thank you so much for being out here tonight. In the interest of time, I will try to quickly get through the thank yous to Cap and Don and Lauren, everyone who's helped us and been incredible hosts. This is one of the sort of fanciest residencies I've done, so really great. Lots of generosity, great resources. And this notion of Black futures, I really hope that we're able to engage this in the Q&A. I was thinking while everyone was performing, I'm not sure if this is something that we should just be doing or if we should try to talk about it, maybe let other people talk about it. We'll see. But But one of the things I was thinking about is, if you remember Latasha and Val in the video, and this way that when you're doing that kind of performance, there's this kind of open space where you get all this kind of overlapping of images and language and sound, and that's something that sort of bears down on me in writing, trying to figure out how to create a linguistic space that has some of that opening and that sort of shimmer. And when you do that, sometimes it's hard to retain or sustain the kind of clarity level of the prose. So sometimes one maybe feels like they get lost when they're listening. So you might feel some of that when I read. I also want to say the work that I presented in the lab were drawings, and that was important because I was interested in seeing how these drawings sort of came out of my writing practice, and thinking about the lines coming out of writing into the visual plane. And I thought to complete the circle by reading the work that comes sort of after the drawings, which in a way tries to return the lines to language, but now affected by what lines can do in the sort of abstract spaces of drawing. So you'll notice that these lines they like to loop and curl back and go forward and under themselves and make squares and dismantle squares. So I'm going to read a few pages from a novel in progress. It's in the Ravaka series. It's actually not the book that's coming out, which apparently came out today, but is the book that comes after that. Thank you. This one doesn't have a title, but it's about the grasses, and I'm not going to, it would just take me forever to try to explain to you what's going on here. So I think you should just draw instead while I'm reading. And I will say one thing, that maybe Black Futures has something to do with crepuscular, because it's in all of our work, and I'm going to say this word too, I believe, in a couple minutes. So crepuscular, we'll have to talk about that. So I'll just jump in here from an untitled novel about the grasses of Ravaka. This is, I think, is the last book in the series, and it feels like this is the kind of history of the people sort of world conjuring, to use Victoria's term from the other day. Space moves and gets wide and contracts and pulls people in, pushes them out, just kind of stands still sometimes, forgets itself, said crossing the plane. And we weren't talking about objects in space, the enormous objects built in a moment, collectors of time. You spend your day in them, in one, moving between floors, departing for an hour, returning, departing for 3 hours, leaving one, going into another, calling one, the Poussard, another, tailor nicks, many others with names of various origins, many foreign, many inconsequential, without reference. You just say where you're going, and I take the word in my body. I never asked its history. I rarely asked. But it wasn't the enormous objects that at first moved, just our notions about location. We'd say, over there, the density, here, sparseness, here, the hills, here, the great plain, there, more density, behind that, the flat wall, and here, the most dense, downtown. We'd talk about our neighborhoods. I'm in Mahai, I'm in Sahai, I'm in Mahai, Water City. I'm in Sahai, Bridge City. Rab is in Surat, Circle City. You walk the streets surrounding Follander Hill, the blue-black mountain, talking about verdict. Everything was dense, but on top of that, things were spread out. You had this plain, but underneath sprawled the old city, which went on without people talking about it, which harbored and evolved, most certainly grew as we grew. It didn't need to give reports on itself and didn't haunt the upper streets, and maybe didn't call the buildings out of their locations as I think it did. though not to itself, not below ground, not among the cathedrals, just out of the center, perhaps to make a new center. The buildings in Ravaka migrate, if you didn't know that. Something people wouldn't be able to find immediately, some space for our future, because a city couldn't convince another city to fix itself. It could steal that city, talk it out of its ground. No one I knew thought of old Ravaka, but all the while, as I aged, as I went to school, then graduate school, as I began to write novels, as I rode the trains and buses, writing novels, writing about the trains, as people came into my life, I felt it smolder. We all did, but we called it different things. I remember Rab wanted to play music all the time. They talked about the water of his childhood. Water took over everything, said looking out the window, said flailing, said drinking coffee from a traveling mug, dressed in a navy blue wool suit, out of town now. You grew up in a city above a city that went on and was warm from its own infrastructure, and past that gate that led to the park, that led to the bridge, that led into the castle from which, if you found the stairs, you descended, you were there. Bodies hustled there, it was known, but I couldn't put faces to them, nor time, nor any of the usual customs. I tried hello, the house at the gate on the sly when I was very young. I used my voice, I used my torso. I dragged the right foot in my cartwheel, as Dislikoje had instructed, had told all of us when we asked, which we only did when we had her alone, all of us believing she was from somewhere else, thus probably there, the old city, old, deep underground place. What it meant to not think about place was different from never going, but it was a delicate subject between generations and between lovers and between a teacher and her students, between scientists and artists, architects and bookbinders. For everyone, not thinking about was a vast, ever-dividing activity in relation to that city below ground, writing its history on top of ours, taking our city's name. And you couldn't even blame the Basharak here. This was our problem. We, someone, made this divide, required thresholds, named bridges after them. For a long time, though, when we talked about space moving, it was purely description. We were establishing a geography or perpetuating one that had been designed for us in the previous century. We were still getting used to the names they gave us for what parceled space, for what ran between, for what lay horizontally everywhere, for how we divided the above from the below, the luminescent from the nearly rough formations, that saturation which changed color every hour. They only gave it one name. When the volume where we moved our bodies, built our homes, was without lumen, the characters that stumbled about, devising language, wanting the body to be a pen. It was as if these figures were born out of that part of the day where distinctions in the geography were erased. They had a different concept of space, saw it more, saw it move, put numbers to it, said buildings, said night sky. And I grew up between the day and the night in the middle room and grew up to record the city. I followed the elders' numbers. They assigned me a task that was unique to me, which only one person did at a time at 20-year intervals. I was to take the names they had devised for the different acts of space, how it moved, where it moved, what it took in its possession, and write recursive description of those spaces, noting for each passing day or by the hour or the half day, it was hard to see space in the smaller increments, those that often eluded strengths of the eye, moments, partial moments, the fragments that surrounded us. I was to note the particularities of space changing, and at the end of my tight organized passages, I was to place numbers, solutions to equations. I was to draw semblances and enactments of space in medias res, catch it changing. I used my eyes like I was doing now between sleeps as the bus crept across the plain, and later I used instruments of my own design. in the midst of which an open field spread toward the neighboring country and a slow question, fanning left and right toward the train stations, Halai and Halai, encircling the families of Ravika, their festivals, their endeavors, Rab and Litik writing histories, the trio drawing the first maps, John Devine practicing solo for voice, the Lejaks, the Cartouches, everybody sipping something, eating out of homemade paper bags, and meeting here all over as a daily ritual of being part of a story that couldn't be written, but which itself contained many that could. We came by bus or train and all weather from every square of the city performing the staking parai, essential to the health of our language. You laid things out, you dug your feet in, you walked the periphery of your desired spot and called out the names of those presents, pausing for each person's response. Mama's get some louder than everyone, becoming her moniker for that season, for that arrangement of bodies. John Devine next to us, talking to himself in his own arrangement, remote and strange, coveted. First, you called the names of those with you, your group, then you called upon your neighbors, the groups you're bisecting, placing at new angles. It would be rude not to acknowledge the interruption, how you have altered space. Their responses differing in length from your intimates. You needed to know their plan for the day, when they arrived, who they were expecting, what would be the nature of the day's activities. Were they writing? Were they playing a sport? If there were tensions between one group and another, John Devine had a minor dispute with Cito. Both parties had to perform an experiment in the interstitial space, elaborate and public, starting from the ground. John Devine lifting his pelvis with his head and feet remaining on the ground, said, always, said plenty was then, wondered if being in the day was nearing, was diaphanous, and Cito moving swiftly beneath the bridge of him, removing all rocks and bramble, rolling the R of Emergil, and all of us involved felt something release in the environment, a divide form, a quiet water filling the gap. We sat down and organized our snacks. All day in the grasses, we made these constellations, the three of us, then some meters away, John Devine, then more meters on the other side of Jandov, Kasasi's ever-growing family, Elil and her cousins, babies last summer in the center, drawing circles on craft paper, and the new babies now in baskets, none belonging to Kesasi, but rather to her sons and daughters, the sons and daughters in their own encampments on the other side of the road. Kesasi's schema being intervened by Frundime's arrival, now reading the 11th volume of a series, shouting out his favorite words, and Dura Rejaldar and counterpoint. Others made spirals of our afternoon in that season, in that arrangement of three, Mama, me, Cito, and these families of Ravika were the map upon which the trio drew. We were one map laid upon another map, the grasses on top of other maps that sought out time and choreography, what a body did 5 years ago on that day in the spot where Bernard now lay sleeping. The stories of the grasses moved between generations, cohering at certain times of the day, becoming mappable, then dispersing, leaving filaments at the edge of space. Our conversations ended there too, where a collective dream picked up again about dusty novels, about bodies crossing terrain, falling down, bodies putting names to things, at one point trying to shave the grasses. We lay with our novels tucked under our heads, burrowing into stories we all knew, but everyone looking for new entrances. Our history was full of novels being written in public between sleeps with bread in your mouth, novels usually about other novels, where maybe you recognize a woman folding white sheets on the top of an old house, a trio of women sitting to draw, though this wouldn't be the same trio who were alive in the moment of our reading or writing, our lying back looking through the grasses, spying Aaron and Hadan. What are they doing? Building something. It also wouldn't be people who were dead. In a sense, there was always a trio of women since the very first ululation of air across the plain, since the very first crack of atmosphere, of motion among the ground's objects, the things flying. There has been a trio of women drawing, and Aaron and Hadan, all time divided and meted out among the novels, the dreams, the paragraphs, and not just those that we carried and manufactured, but also those that we inherited and we passed on, sad to say, even those we imported. We gave our time to other languages, to neighboring countries, to Bashir of all places. You recognize a person in a novel because someone has performed the dividing pariah on her. Someone wrote her name down on a piece of paper and handed that paper to another person in full regalia, observing the thus splits until the second person handed the paper back to the first it had been read. And I was writing the last words of something when Mama stood up and clapped her hands in the crepuscular air and shook first the left hand with her right and then the right with her left of Kesasi and blew 5 times into the face of John Devine and accepted a loaf of bread from Frontheim, who wanted to come closer, and gave a sentence to Latik's father walking by, which it should have promptly forgotten. Also Cito to dismantle the tent, to close the window and fold the tent, and instructed me on how to return the books to the satchel, where to place the one I just finished in relation to the one I wish to start tomorrow, closing the satchel with some quiet words. Thank you.
Thanks to everyone. Thank you. Let's give one more round of applause, please, to Latasha and Val, John, and Renee. We are on a little bit of a tight time schedule because we have to get to dinner, which means that we have about 15 to 18 minutes for questions and conversation, which we're going to do now. So we're just going to set up and invite you to, of course, stay for that part as well. So we have to pass this mic around. So I actually want to start with a question that has to do with narrative. And then, maybe we'll try to turn that toward some thinking about this possibility of Black futures. And so this comes actually from Renee's Calamities, and in it her character says, I wanted to surround myself with other people who were thinking about narrative and asking themselves whether they were for or against it. And so because there's this really cool way that each of you seems to be thinking about and enacting narrative very differently, I guess I want to start with that question. First, for or against it, and then what is it that undergirds narrative for you, or what does it mean, I guess? What does narrative mean? Because I'm not sure that we would all give it the same language. And then I'll just say, before I let you answer the question, that one of the reasons I brought the three of you together is because I was thinking about who is it that has a kind of what I would think of as like a future, like a narrative that feels like it's of some moment in the future, like a way of attending to it that's in the future. And I couldn't really put language to it, it was just like a kind of sensation. So that's why I'm asking you about it, yeah.
You're just going to skip the narrative question? I think that we can't escape narrative, that to even open our mouths is to begin a narrative, just because we are sharing a vocabulary and we are in a culture where we are already reading signs before the signs appear. And I find that really exciting and frustrating, So my relationship to narrative is always sort of trying to turn a kind of interiority towards it, which is why drawing has become an amazing thing, because I can be in narrative without having to write narrative. And so I'm learning a lot about just thinking about the energy of the kind of aggregation of things that come when it happens. Yeah, I think that the question of for or against it came in a kind of response to this feeling where for a while people really wanted to talk about it. And not only do they want to talk about narrative, they want to talk about anti-narrative. And so I don't know, I think that those things are really useful on one hand, especially if you are using the questions as a way to kind of think about those components of narrative which we often take for granted, like memory and pace and logic and flow. And I think that if you want to look at those things, it's really exciting to sort of trouble the space of narrative so that they just kind of stand out more. Do you want to answer now?
I'm still processing.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
This is working.
Oh,
Yes.
you have your own? Okay.
Latasha passes me. Well, just to follow up on what Renee is saying, I think narrative is inescapable. We are embedded in it. It is the way we make sense of our world, our sense of our lives. The fascinating thing to me, of course, is one of the reasons I wrote a book entitled Counter Narratives was that I was interested in the idea that you could have people living in the exact same space, exact same world, exact same society, exact same world, and have very, very different views on the world, and have one set of people or sets of people understand, because they had to, because it was imposed upon them, the sort of logic of the narrative of, let's say, the dominant narrative, and the people living in the kind of dominant narrative with the privilege not to have to think about the people, right, who were in a subaltern position. So I think that sort of some of the components of narrative are, of course, language, to me, storytelling, and I'm really sort of interested in, I mean, I didn't read any today, but I have these poems that are very much, that use very elemental language. And I was trying to think about how the kind of lyric space that they create is very different from, is linked to, but different from, even the most elemental stories I've ever written.
Like, ditto.
I mean, so I was, that kind of thinking across, especially your most recent works, the three of you, actually, I was thinking about how, this question of whether or not we're still in this moment as writers, as makers, where we feel like we have to attend to some unattended to story or some unattended to space. Renee, in your work, you talk a lot about space, and in my graduate class today, we actually started to talk about that space of the space of the erotic, as opposed to, and that was a kind of celebration of what has not been foreclosed, the celebration in the space of desire, as opposed to a desire to kind of fill in space, So I want to try to circle around in some way to this question of a possibility for some thinking through Black futures, because it does seem as though even in that kind of loosely constructed framework, we feel compelled in some way to attend to this kind of past that has not been enough attended to. Is there like a thought question and a direct question?
What is the question?
Yeah, I didn't have a question. It's more like a, so do you feel, I'll ask a direct question. So in the video, I was really interested in this kind of juxtaposition between kind of demolition and then the kind of, celebration of a kind of recognizable Afrocentric, I suppose, body. And so to me, that seemed like some kind of conversation between the past and the future. So I guess I'm wondering how you thought about it. This is a question for you now. Now I'm asking you a direct question. This is a question for you in particular. Like how you thought about that, and also like how it emerged from, or how it emerged from your reading across John and Renee's works.
Okay. Well, I think, you gotta excuse me because I'm like, my throat is phlegmy. I think with the video, there were two things that I was pondering upon, and I guess this is somehow connected to Black Futures. The demolition, the current trend of Black churches being demolished in Harlem. Not because they have no choice, but because they've made an arrangement with a developer who is interested in that property, that land, and they are in the dilemma of where they are in debt because these are older buildings, their congregations are smaller, and they are trying to figure out, like the rest of many within the Black community in Harlem, how to survive. What is Black survival in the future? And this is one of the options, to make an agreement. So when looking at these structures, some of which were former synagogues, some of which were former dance hall spaces, performing theater spaces, many of which architecture you will never see again once they are demolished, I wondered what is the importance of ritual? What is the importance of the rites being read? With religious spaces, there's some type of ritual that takes place to open up the space for folks to gather, the open up ceremony. And I kind of juxtaposed it with footage from 3 different events. One was an Egungun, a presentation of an Egungun masquerade that was presented by the African village of South Carolina, which has its own land. They were one of those earlier African American communities who basically said, we need the space. We need Black space in order for us to sustain. One of the other footage was from Brazil of a demonstration for religious tolerance, which was largely organized by the Candomblé community in Bahia. And the other footage was from the annual celebration for Yemeya, which is largely organized by the Yoruba community in New York. And where every year they make a offering to Yemeya. So I thought about the 3. So religious tolerance, Yemeya being the primordial mother of creation, and the Egungun being the ancestors. And juxtaposing it with this demolition, which was also followed by the demolition of the Casa do Fernandes building, which is in Lagos, Nigeria, which was demolished in last year. I'm going to get to answering this question somehow. That was demolished last year, despite the fact that it was recognized by UNESCO and the state of Brazil as being a landmark, because the history surrounding that building, as well as a community of Nigerians in Lagos, was that these were newly freed Brazilians, Afro-Brazilians who had returned to the continent of Africa. And basically constructed their own community and built these buildings. So were there any rights read? And basically looking at the future of Black space, is it even there? And how, like, what is to be done if, like, what is the value, I guess? Something that I read in Renee's book, having to do whether or not how do we concern ourselves with these structures? I guess that's basically.
Either one of you want to respond to those? Sorry?
Of the churches, all of them had cornerstones laid maybe 200-300 years ago, and a lot of them with Masonic rituals. And inside those cornerstones, they have a treasure trove of documents, and it's so ironic as far as for the future. I'm wondering, on one instance, who's going to reap the benefits of any objects, papers, or whatever that's in those cornerstones? Some of those might be priceless. So where it's the churches can't support the church, but by the demolition of the church, they might have a treasure. And then you can look at it worldwide when you look at, say, Iraq and all the things that are going on in the Middle East, all of these mosques from thousands of years ago. The cornerstones, who's get the treasure. But it's sort of ironic with the future and the past. Any comments on that?
Well, I'll say that's a very good point, and I think a lot of times when we think about the future, and we think about gentrification, hyper-gentrification. I mean, that's the point you make is one that's often lost. A church that is erected at a particular moment is not just a religious structure, but it's in a very important social, political, cultural, and economic space. And in fact, many churches, many buildings, I mean, not just churches, but many buildings often have those cornerstones that have all kinds of things buried in them. And I mean, one question is, I mean, first of all, do we even know that they're there? And when these buildings are being torn down so that you can have, a 30 or 40 or 50-story glass towers, it seems to be happening a lot in New York and now, of course, increasingly New Jersey, because there's a sort of a gold rush. Is anyone attending to this issue that you talk about? And if they are, right, where does that work go? Where do those treasures, where do those sort of reliquaries go? Do they go to a library? Do they go to an archive? Do they remain in the community? Do they become commodities that circulate and so that they can be sold at auction, and the developer who bought the building can then make money off of them, and so yet another sort of precious aspect of that community is lost? I mean, these are, I think, very, very important questions. And as we've seen, the history of colonialism, imperialism, et cetera, you think about all of the treasures that have been taken away from their original sites, context, and everything else, and then are placed in a museum somewhere, and people go, ooh and ah at what this beautiful thing that's in a museum. But of course, it's been decontextualized and it's been robbed of, it's stolen from its original site, its original source. So what happens then when you have, peoples who then say, and it's not just, of course, outside Europe, but even in Europe, where, for example, the Greeks say to the British, okay, you have to return the Elgin marbles, right? And the British say, well, this is something that people have come to our museum for generations to see. And the Greeks say, but they belong to us, right? And not just to us, but in their original context or in the new context in Greece, then they, of course, also belong to humanity, so.
So this is the time now when we turn to you. So thank you, sir, for that segue, and ask if the audience to ask questions. There's a microphone there.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. My question is, and then context. My question is, in the Black future, will we need structures or bodies or tools? And I come to that, that's my question, very simple. because I was struck by how corpuscular was used twice. But in the two times I think I heard it, it was either the night and the air, so these sort of abstract things were trying to be made into a body. And whereas in the video, you see the structures being demolished and replaced with air. And then I'm listening to Val, is that right, Val Jeanty, reproduce sounds that I've heard everywhere, a lot of different places, but not with the actual tools through electronica. So my question is, do we need them anymore?
Structures.
Structures, bodies,
In the future.
in your body.
Well, I just have to say, I love this question or this idea about Black futures, which I guess now we're talking about as if it's something that makes sense, or that, you know, it's something that we all have agreed upon. I don't really know what that means, but what I like about it has to do with something that I'm not sure if I can really articulate it. It doesn't feel like it's a literal question about in 50 years, what will our spaces look like? What will our bodies look like? Because I mean, I think that we all do have that question, and that's an important one. But for me, it's more a question about what the sort of mysteries or the unknown that we are seeing in our works right now about spaces or identities or emotions that we don't have language for, that are in transit or are becoming or something in that way. So when I saw what you were doing with the overlaying of the images, and then with your voice and the delay and then the incredible things that were happening on percussion, it felt to me like all those questions, inheritance, space, body, Blackness, like all those things are present, but they are combining in a way that to me sort of extends past where we are and where we're seeing. I'm really interested in how we can kind of contain that contemporarily, or like see it or expand it somehow. So I don't know if that makes sense, but it feels like a pretty abstract idea to me that I'm really interested in sort of trying to look at, but this is just my beginning to do that. Do you want to go?
Sure. I'm gonna actually quote two people and play around with their two quotes. One is Arthur Jaffa, the filmmaker who was the cinematographer for Daughters of the Dust. The other is Theaster Gates, who is a bunch of things. So he was? Oh, okay. So Theaster last week at Cooper Union talked about near dying things, a tree. So a tree that is being scheduled to be cut down because it's half dead, and the city basically saying, well, we'll just turn it into mulch. Well, why do you, and Theaster's take is, well, why do you have to turn it into mulch? Why is that just the immediate go-to? That the tree can become a table, that the tree can become floors, that the tree can become material for an artist to create a table. Basically, what do we do with near dying things? As in the case with the churches, what can be done? What tools do we have as a society, not just Black people, to salvage near dying things? Do we want to? Author Jaffa, AJ, basically said to some folks a couple of weeks ago in Chicago, what is space? You know, do Black people have to occupy a space in order for it to be a Black space? Do Black people need space? What makes a space a Black space? And I don't know the answer to that yet. Do we need bodies? Yeah, we need bodies, because if there's no bodies, what is the point? I mean, we need, I'm gonna get, I think I'm gonna get like new agey here. We need blood, we need breath, we need muscles alive, we need brains functioning, we need therapists, we need physical therapists, we need, good shoes. We need toenail clippers. But we need all of those things. So I guess my answer is yes. But with the space and the tools, it's like, do we have the capacity to revive near-dead things, and do we want to? And what is space?
And I'll just add just very quickly, I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned this idea of near-dead things, because it makes me think of disposability. And we think there's a discourse of disposability that's really kind of all around us. I mean, when I was writing counter-narratives, I was thinking, I'm writing about the past, and so many aspects of our past are still with us in the present. And people have said, oh, I mean, there's I think the famous sociologist Orlando Patterson said, he had that essay, I think, in the 70s, where he basically says, Black Americans need to just, basically cut off this idea that slavery continued into the present day, become new, sort of like the new blacks, right? He was arguing for new blackdom well before anyone else, I guess. And people came at him and said, this is really kind of crazy. What are you talking about? If you look about policing, if you look at segregation, of various kinds, the jury, de facto, et cetera, basically the past is still with us. And I mean, one of the sort of aspects of the past is still with us is this idea of disposability and Black disposability, right? I mean, when you're talking about trees and this idea of like, we don't care, we're going to turn it into mulch, or just, I don't know, bury it or throw it into the river or whatever we're going to do with it, sell it to China, as opposed to thinking about, what sort of potentialities does this near dying thing have? I mean, I'm not saying that we're near dying, but I think that, kind of rethinking our place and space in this society, in this world, right, and sort of moving from, sort of changing the narrative from being disposable people, and we see like the if you look at the number of murders, quickly if you think about what Black Lives Matter has been protesting, you see that that they're trying to call attention to this, and so this is one of the things I think when we think about our futures, we think about structure, we think about our bodies, we think about space, sort of rethinking how we are and exist and move through the world is going to be key.
I think we have time for one more question if it's quick, and then if we promise to be quick answerers, we will, if there's one more question.
I had a question about balancing pleasure and the need to write about difficult and sometimes painful intellectual questions. This started off when I was thinking about John's work. Balancing the pleasure of the two authors that you're writing about, their physical pleasure and their lust, with the need to answer a difficult question about, a difficult and painful question about forgotten history. And I'm sure it applies to the other two artists, the need to balance the pleasure of world building with the pain of answering questions about spaces that are often misused and abused.
Well, I'll just quickly say that it's an excellent question, and this is a sort of challenge throughout this book and through a lot of my work. I mean, with someone like Langston Hughes, there is this a kind of sort of open space, empty space. I mean, to the point where just a few years ago, I was at a James Baldwin conference of all places, and I had an argument with a scholar who was saying, I mean, her comment about Hughes was, the gays have taken him over. Right? And I was like, this is really crazy. So what do you mean the gays have taken him over? And she had this whole idea, you know, and her response to me was, well, there's no proof that he was gay. And I said, and one of the scholars sitting next to me was also made the point that, you know, there's no proof that he wasn't. But then, of course, if you read his work, you know, you see that there's quite a few hints, you know, facts, right? A lot of material there that actually does give us a richer portrait of who he was. And then, of course, actually I met someone who sort of knew about his life and gave me the real story. But the thing I say all this to say that, right, you know, that the one way to think about writing about someone like Langston Hughes is to approach him and to maintain that silence. And another way is to try to write back into the past, right? Be a person from the future writing back into the past. And with this story, what I tried to do was to give us a sense both of those sort of moments of presence and of silence. So that's why those little bursts of white space and the ellipses, because of course, you know, I wanted to capture that silence in the midst of, as you were saying, this moment of pleasure that may or may not have happened, even though there are many signs that point to its possibility.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming. Their book signing will happen right out here. Thanks to our writers, musicians, our translators.